Welcome to the Stewart Squared podcast, where me and my father talk about what happened in the 1980s, the 90s, the early 2000s, and the 10s to understand where AI is headed based on the past of where the personal computing revolution went. So excited to dig into another topic with you, particularly around networking today. So, what is networking?
Wow. Uh, so I have to roll way back based on what you just said in terms of the introduction, because when personal computers were introduced, there was no networks at all. Um, Computers operated on their own. They could be directly connected with a wire, but there was no protocol for connecting any two computers together. And so when I got involved with the personal computers industry in 1980, uh, there wasn't even a concept of networking. And previously, the way that computers were shared is you'd have a mainframe or a mini computer with terminals, and there would be more than one terminal connected to the same computer.
Oh,
There was no network. So
oh,
a network inherently means that any one computer can talk to any other computer. Talk to is a term they have to be careful with, but can communicate with um, through some kind of protocol. And there needs to be a protocol for it to work with any two different kinds of computers. And that's a process that took a very long time. So we used to
how
have
long?
we used to have the phenomenon in the 1980s of this is the year of the network. Uh, and this is the year of the network went for about 10 years before the network actually happened. So the first instance of a network um, was invented. There were several, but the one that really ended up being adopted was what are called local area networks, i.e., all within a particular space, actually. It was invented by a guy named Bob Metcalf, and who invented Ethernet. And the Ethernet protocol was a way of connecting computers together in a building, basically. Anything outside a building was considered a wide area network. So the local area and the wide area networks were two different things. And there were instances of wide area networks using what were called point-to-point technologies. So, from one building to another 10 miles away, you could connect the two together, and then it would be two local area networks connected into a wide area network. But the real evolution came in the early 90s with the internet. And the internet itself was originally a non-commercial educational resource. So the first instances of the internet were inside academic institutions and government institutions. And so they invented the internet as a way to connect diverse places, and
Yeah.
the internet could run on any particular physical network. But so frequently the connection between two different places on the same internet were either dial-up or some form of proprietary point-to-point network. So there was like, I won't be specific about this, but in order for the internet to become commercial and generally available, there had to be like a whole stack of different protocols, TCP/IP, um, and a security layer and a bunch of others
Uh,
before it became feasible. So the first instance of a commercial internet was in 1994.
wow.
And so if you measure from 1980 to 1994, that's kind of the span of time before we had a legitimate public internet. And that was just barely in 1994. So people who were looking forward could tell that this was going to turn into something, uh, but the path forward was still pretty vague. And um, so the first browser was Mozilla, which later became Netscape, and or turned into Netscape. Um, and Netscape, you could browse the internet. You had to know how to get the connection to the internet and download the Mozilla browser. Um, And so if you didn't have somebody in an IT group near you, that was still a very complicated process. And that's when I got on in 1994. I got the IT department at InfoWorld to give me a floppy disk with the Mozilla app on it. And I spent probably 2 months ignoring my job and just browsing around going, wow, look at all this stuff.
Found.
So we're getting a lot of echo. I just got a bunch of echo. I don't know if that's true for
So what kind of things were you finding on the internet in 1994?
God. That's so hard to remember. Like you could, boy, what
Yeah.
was I looking?
I can't remember what I was first finding when I was first on the internet.
at?
Well, I remember AOL chat rooms. I remember that was the big thing of me
Yeah,
realizing what the internet was once I could talk to random people with text, only text.
yeah. AOL was a proprietary network, was not internet. Right? So you dial into
Yeah.
AOL
Yeah.
and all the protocols were set by AOL. So that was a very safe environment that a lot of people adopted before the internet because you just get the AOL app and they distributed it on everything all over. And then you'd dial up and you'd get to do chat and other things. What I remember looking at was, well, I can't say I remember, but what I think I was looking at was primarily um, what was already there for educational and academic purposes. Um, and there was just the beginning of, you know, generally interesting stuff.
Yeah.
But so one of the issues, I'll explain it this way. So I was at InfoWorld at the time, um, and I got InfoWorld's IT department to give me the tech, the protocols and the app to be able to get on the internet. Um, So there were no publications on the internet at the time, and yet I was editor of a publication. So I was sitting there going, "Holy crap, you'd be able to do everything we do
Yeah.
on the internet." But the only paradigm I had to go by was printing a magazine,
Yeah.
once a week in that case. And so I tried to imagine what it would look like if we did InfoWorld and online. And we did. We did it at the end of 94, and we called it
Wow.
InfoWorld Electric, because this is me. I was sitting there going, well, how do I distinguish between the printed publication
Oh,
and the
yeah.
thing online? So I
Digital.
wanted to,
Digital wasn't there yet?
no, well, it
Yeah.
was digital, but I wanted it to be, different from the print publication. So I called it InfoWorld Electric, just
Yeah.
as a moniker. It wasn't, when you're branding, it's not totally
Uh-huh.
logical.
Uh-huh.
And the InfoWorld Electric really ended up being an internal code name for our website. Because when we published the website eventually, it's just called info.com. And but we got the URL, we started thinking, well, how all of our designers were used to designing for a page, a physical page with bleeds and dimensions, and you put ads in there and compose the page. Well, on the internet, pages don't really matter. Uh, so it was a real stretch for us to figure out how to represent InfoWorld online. And so it was at that level, right? We were
Yeah.
banging around looking at what other people had done and people who were farther ahead of us, not by much, but
And who were those guys? Who were the people who were farther ahead? Do you remember?
no.
Yeah.
Like probably Dr. Dobbs' journal. I think they got on before we did. Um, the what was the other ones? There was a bunch of really nerdy publications that had sprung up in and around Silicon Valley, including
Okay. I just got a great insight into what's currently going on related to AI and the talk of AGI and OpenAI releasing all these oh 01, oh 02, oh 03, oh 04 models, the incredible hype monster that seems to just be unleashed every time they do something. But also how the evals get like they're putting out their own evals. That's not really related to the point. But so let me try to back this up all the way. So media, I'm really interested in this idea of media, and we got media technology. The first media technology seems to be the printing press. And then the printing press evolves into this sort of letter writing thing that was happening all over Europe, which then evolved into the sort of United States. Like the United States was connected with Europe because they're all sending each other letters. The printing press is allowing them for all to make books. And then fast forward way, way, way into the future, we get radio, we get TV, and then we have your father, my grandfather, writing books, writing publication, writing columns. And then all of a sudden we get networking, which you just described excellently. And with networking, we have this thing that allows us to immediately and digitally publish things, but it completely reworks the whole publishing. And now we're in this AI world, and we have all this media technology that we've just been discussing. And I fast forwarded over everything that we've been talking about in terms of the internet, magazines, everything like that. And now we have Twitter, we have Reddit, we have all these different media technologies that are out there, and they're all spreading hype about AGI. And that seems to be profoundly effective or profoundly weird. There's something I'm trying to get to, which is like there are people connected to these media technologies, and then there are normal people. And the people who are connected to these media technologies are adopting hype, some of which turns out to be true, and some of which doesn't. And it's I'm struggling with this right now because there's a lot of fantasies going on with AI. Some of those fantasies are going to be real. And you've seen fantasies turn from a fantasy into reality before. And
So
yeah,
starting point, the starting point is, not everything's going to be true,
yeah,
which is core, right?
yeah,
Because when you read all this stuff, you have to understand that whoever's writing it or talking about it is acting like it will all be true,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
it's in their interest.
yeah.
So you start by saying, well, there's some part of this you can just filter out. Um, and in order to do that, you have to have a point of view. And we have talked about this, but
Mm,
I do have a point of view. And I may not be right, I may be right, have a
mm,
point of view. And you can't possibly distinguish between real and fantasy without having a point of view. So the vast majority of the population doesn't have a point of view because they don't know what the hell's going on.
yeah,
Uh, so they read this stuff and come to their own conclusions. And almost everybody, including some of the most knowledgeable people, are believing everything. And which is why we're in this hype cycle. And you can tell, I can tell right now that the hype cycle is teetering at the top. And and I think everybody actually knows this, and I've seen it written about. But the valuations of AI companies, the fact that it's very hard to tell the difference between one AI company and another, other than OpenAI, because they're kind of was the first, and they are hype masters. Um, the is all bound up in the hype. And so, how do you decide what's real and what's not real? So, my filter is uh, that um, that if it has no value to you personally, it's
mm,
not real.
mm,
And this is formed out of my whole experience with the personal computer and all the technologies that have happened in between. At the point at which the technology has value to people individually is the tipping point. That's where
mm.
suddenly stuff starts to happen. Now, you can't say that all this AGI stuff, or not all generative AI stuff, is hype because people are finding real value in chatbots. And I talk to people and they're using them. Valerie uses them. My friend Peter uses them. They're all like using it and going, well, this is really helpful and useful. And so they're inclined to believe everything that they read about.
Mm.
I don't have any, I've found no value in ChatGPT or the other chatbots personally. And and I know what I want them to do. And what I want them to do is to use data, whether small or large language models, but in real time
Yeah,
to help me do what I do every day.
yeah.
Now, you pinged me an hour early because you forgot that we operate on daylight savings time, and I think Argentina doesn't. And so you thought we were supposed to talk to each other an hour earlier. My test of real AGI is when the
And
computer
that's
system
so far
can
away.
yeah, I mean, for them to recognize these stupid daylight savings time and time zones and all that kind of stuff that's actually useful because I find that to be a problem constantly every day in my life. But the sort of ethereal idea that these huge batch processed databases called LLMs uh, are a replacement for human intelligence, I just find laughable. And So we haven't hit AGI, and we're not about to hit AGI, even though people are actively talking about it, mainly because OpenAI did a contract with Microsoft that said that when we achieve AGI, your equity turns into debt. So, so
That.
you know,
Oh
anyway,
man, it's so weird. It's just like did so but the networking part seems really interesting and related to this because essentially what networking seems to have done is created a exocortex, a brain surrounding each of our individual brains that's stored digitally and but in real time. It does real time in the sense that if somebody tweets on Twitter, somebody immediately sees that tweet and it ripples through the collective very quickly as long as somebody's interested in it. Um, when network like, well, actually, let's go back into history and talk
let me
about.
give you
Yeah,
let
yeah,
me
go
give
for
you
it.
a history that's different, that's
Yeah.
talking about exactly what you're talking about. So as you know, I'm raising a new venture fund, and my partner has come up with this pitch that what we face going forward is the third convergence.
Mhm.
Well, that begs the question of what were the first two convergences?
Yeah, nice.
First convergence was named by Nicholas Negroponte, the guy that started the Media Lab at MIT, uh, in 1979. So this is like when personal computers showed up. He said there's going to be a convergence between publishing, broadcasting, and computing. And this would change, the computing part would change the publishing and broadcasting businesses tremendously, which happened. In other words, and this is part of our pitch, we say he's right. And over the next 30 years, between 1980 and 2010, that's everything that was happening. And that involved desktop publishing and involved digital distribution on DVDs, and a bunch of other stuff, nonlinear editing and so on and so forth in the media business. And remember, we're focused on the media business. So then the second convergence is called the Dubberly convergence, and it was uh, named by a guy, ironically named Hugh Dubberly, uh, who was a designer at Apple and then left and created a whole thesis around the second convergence. And the second convergence called for everything to be connected to everything else. And so, you kind of think, well, the internet was in the mid 90s, but actually it didn't really effectively become a generic, generally available networking technology until the teams. And so all the things that we think about, like the Web 2.0, social media, high-speed broadband networking, streaming, all those things started to happen once we had a real-time, high-performance public network. And so he forecasts the social media, social networking, and all that kind of stuff,
Mm,
and streaming. And so, where you could watch movies in real time on over the internet. And uh, so now we're forecasting a third convergence. Like this is the pitch for our venture capital firm. If any listeners want to know, let me know. Um, so um, the third convergence, we believe, is where you're going to lose the ability to tell between digital and real.
yeah.
And it's not quite true yet because you can still identify, even with AI, when it's making pictures or stuff. You can usually tell that this was generated, not um, and it's not confusing. But increasingly over time, or when we say over the next 20 years, that that this is going to become harder and harder to tell the difference between digital and real. And we say it's over the next 20 years because the movie Ready Player One was set in 2045,
Uh,
the
yeah.
proposed time of that movie. And if you go watch Ready Player One, it posits a future where we go back and forth between uh, virtual reality and digital and real reality. And this is a Steven Spielberg movie, and it's interesting that he had this proposal for what it would look like in the future. So our firm is investing in the technologies that will enable the third convergence.
Uh, um, So yeah, there's a lot there we can talk about.
Yeah.
The 20-year time frame is interesting because it does feel like it's coming. One of the most interesting things I've in the last few years is how heavily the deep fakes were predicted and how little impact they've had.
So
In
do you remember
yeah,
me talking about the year of the network? That it
yes,
took like 15 years for the
yes,
network
yeah,
to
yeah,
actually
exactly right.
happen?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, people can project what's going to happen, can get scared about it and get all excited about it.
but eventually
Um,
it happens.
and usually when it happens, they've forgotten to worry about it.
Yes. Uh, yeah, okay, interesting. So now, what is your take on the drones? I'm sure you've seen the drones. This is it. So I come from a philosophical background that we might not share, which is that reality is already hard to understand what is reality and what is false because we have a brain that is constantly hallucinating. I'm under the impression that all of us are hallucinating all the time and we pretend that that's reality, but reality is something different, which we can't really touch. And so I feel like that's already happening and that what you're talking about is just like it's going to make it really clear that that's happening already because then it will become undeniable.
So, uh, anytime something actually happens, all the elements of the thing are already there.
Yeah.
It takes some kind of event
Yeah.
or insight or uh, inflection point to make it actually happen and everybody adopts it, right? So there were instances of social networking. I can't even remember the names. I could tell there was something that had mind in it. There were a bunch of early social networks, none of which actually became
Mm.
commercially successful until Twitter and Facebook happened. Um, and those were different in themselves. And so at the time at which our prediction becomes true, we already know what technologies are required to make that happen.
Yeah, because you're going to pay attention to it as it happens. And this is the interesting thing I've been thinking about recently is like if you remain grounded, you can essentially separate the hype. You can get out of that cycle that you're talking about, which is people get scared about it, forget that they get scared about it, then it happens when nobody's expecting. But if you're
Mhm.
paying attention the entire time, you can kind of see it happening as long as you don't stop paying attention to it. Is that
You
accurate?
have to have an open mind and be agile
Yeah.
to pay attention to what actually is happening as opposed to what you thought would happen.
Yeah. And if you get
So,
invested in it with that sort of
yeah.
fear or anxiety, then you lose out because something happens and yeah.
Let me give you an
Yeah.
anecdote, which is very relevant both to media and what we're talking about. As you know, one of my first investments at NEA was in a company called TiVo.
Mhm.
Um, at the time, the internet was not fast enough to stream. So TiVo would download video onto a hard disk so that you could play it in real time once you had it downloaded. Uh, when we started TiVo, we knew that it was a temporary technology.
Yeah, interesting.
Uh, your uncle and I had these blistering conversations, arguments about when TiVo would go away because he thought it was like a couple of years. And I'm going, no, no, to be able to stream video, there's a lot has to happen. Um,
Yeah,
and so I
interesting.
was saying 10 or more years. And of course I was right. But here's the point, right? That we knew that streaming a video was a better way to do it than
Yeah.
recording it on
Yeah. Both of you
disc.
knew it, but you were
Yeah.
debating on when it would happen.
And and it didn't really happen until Netflix switched from renting DVDs to streaming and then started making its own stuff, which was about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, so between 1997 and 2015, that's how long it took.
Yeah.
Um, so even I was a little optimistic.
Yeah,
And
interesting.
yeah, now it's embedded in our culture, right? So what's the next? So then you have to always be looking forward
Yeah.
to say, what's the next thing? And believing that there will be a next thing and, wanting to go there, which is why it's very interesting. We're getting a really interesting response to our raising our venture fund because people are going, oh, this is like really interesting.
Yeah.
We haven't heard this from anybody else. And, we're two old guys who've been in the business for more than 30 years. And they look at us and they go, "Yeah, you might be old, but you actually probably know what you're talking about." And
I love it. And so let's go into well, and so there's the media side of what you're talking about, and then there's the transformative technology, which I've been doing interviews on, which is like in the real world, not necessarily in the hallucinated media world where we share. In the real world, like there's going to be really transformative technology. One that seems really clear right now is flying cars. Flying cars seem like they're here at least in
can
the
you buy
technology.
one? Can you buy
Well,
one?
no, yeah, you can buy one coming in January. One of my podcast guests is selling one at CES in February, and that'll be a luxury flying car, hopefully with an autonomous system to come after that. The F
Is is that publicly known? Can you tell me what it
Invo Station, INVO station. And he helped with the Cybertruck at Tesla, and he's built it all so that he can get it straight to production from the prototype. They're going to sell the first prototypes in the luxury vehicle. Um, and he told me flat out, it's happening, it's here, and no one is paying attention to it because it's too sci-fi. Which brings to mind our earlier conversation of just like everybody's forgetting. Everybody predicted flying cars in the 1960s and then was like, no, no, that's too far away. Now they might be here. Which also brings to
is.
mind,
Looking, looks like a flying saucer.
it looks like a UFO, which is really funny because his story on
So
his
I know this guy is a geek
yeah
because he misspells the word uh, flying mileage. He leaves the first E out of mileage. In
yeah uh,
the
and so oh yeah. So the UFO is because he got it from Leonardo da Vinci's drawing of the tank. Also looks like a UFO. He that was his inspiration, but it looks like UFO, which brings to mind what I was about to say, which is about the UFOs on the or not the UFOs, the drones on the eastern seaboard and also on the western seaboard. Do you buy it? Are you following this? Are you following that there are drones being
yeah,
released?
I've been thinking about it.
Yeah.
Um, right now, the government is saying it's a mixture of uh, recreational drones, some commercial drones, and actual fixed wing aircraft. And with a small percentage that they can't totally explain. And that's the official thing. You saw what Trump said. It's like the
Yeah.
government doesn't want to tell us.
Yeah.
And so uh, it's so what I believe is I don't think there is a threat,
Yeah.
but we have to deal with the fact that we have a lot more autonomous vehicles in the air, and which is drones.
Yeah.
And so, so the fact that it's on the East Coast, which is like the densest part of our population, probably inherently explains why people are starting to freak out that there's too many of them, right? Doesn't happen in Santa Fe because there's not enough people. Doesn't happen in, even San Francisco. But in the New York metropolitan area in New Jersey, there's just so goddamn many people that there's a lot of stuff flying around up there. Um, if it, we freaked out about the Chinese balloon and
Yeah.
actually shot it down. That was just one thing.
Yeah.
And so it's, we'll figure it out eventually. But anyway, I don't think it's hallucination, totally.
Oh,
But
interesting. You would because you just well, yeah, okay. Well, there's you just gave me a good insight into something, which is it could just be there have been periods of history where things like that have happened before, where people have come together and hallucinated. Uh, uh, then there's the disinformation, misinformation type of thing.
yeah,
And so I find it interesting. I think what I've been seeing with these drones is that essentially China has been doing this at all the Olympics, at all the things for a long time. They've been doing art shows. And if I channel my grandfather and my great uncle, not really channeling, but channeling their thoughts, like as they've been writing about it, I think China is doing what China does best, which is very subtle that what they have been doing is very subtle. They're pretending it's art, but it's not art. It's their weapons. They're showing the world that they have these weapons, autonomous drones that they can fly, and all these new different things. And I believe that that's what the U.S. government is doing right now, is being like, this is the American version of that. Because they're coming. They've been in wars now for 2 or 3 years with Ukraine, with what was the first one was Armenia versus
inside itself.
Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan. Yep.
So drones cover a lot of ground, and there probably needs to be different categories.
Hmm.
Drones that the U.S. military is using with Israel in the Middle East
Hmm.
are autonomous flying vehicles with bombs on them. And so you don't have to put a pilot at risk. Those cost millions of dollars to build because it comes out of our legacy system.
Hmm.
What Ukraine did was come up with cheap ass things that you could just fly around, including you could attach a small bomb to it and drop it on the Russians. And so that's the thing that's got everybody fascinated because, you know, it's kind of like Ukrainian versions of DJI drones that cost a few $100 to build, so they can build a lot of them and sort of do swarms. That has been predicted for a long time. Swarms have been
Yeah.
talked about for a long time. And, you know, the ability to build small drones at scale implies that we have swarms. Now, the U.S. military, with its current procurement system, is really not able to deal with that, right? So it's startup companies that are beginning to build, you know, the agile, responsive war technologies,
Hmm.
um, which is really interesting to watch the Department of Defense and the U.S. government try to figure out how to include that in their thinking, because they've been used to building huge things that cost hundreds of millions or billions of dollars for 50 years now or more. And so there is this whole revolution coming in military that is about smaller, more agile, and faster, so that you can respond to whatever's new that's happening.
Yeah, it's super interesting. This feels like an opportune time to share some of the crazy hallucinations I've been having about no psychedelics involved. Basically, drone. So I'm gonna get a drone down here, and I'm gonna go skiing with the drone. And so the drone will lift me up the mountain. I think that could work. I might need a very pretty heavy duty. And I was thinking that I could do the same thing for surfing as well. And we've been talking a lot about building all these drone games down here in Buenos Aires, go off into the countryside, and we just got a new idea, a new insight into something I've been thinking for about a year, which is we're going to joust drones on horseback. Joust drones on horseback. Somebody in San Francisco is they are fighting the drones, so they get a stick and go and attack it in this sort of medieval thing. And so we're going to take that one step further and get on horseback and do it with horseback. I think would be
Oh,
really
you're going right back to paintball.
yeah, right. Exactly. Well, yeah, that leads to something I'll share after the show, which I'm not quite ready to talk about publicly yet. Uh, But okay, so media drones covered a lot of territory again, and we got about 20 minutes left. There is this. I love this idea of the fund, which is like the media not knowing what's real. Okay, what are if you can share, what are the first five technologies that unlock everything in terms of this world where we can't tell fiction from reality?
So we have the way we present it is we have five companies
Mm.
that are emblematic of technologies that we're looking for that we've already connected with. So there's five beyond this. Let's start at the bottom. First is production technologies. Um, there's a company called Kubrick, Cuebric, that is able to produce detailed, three-dimensional backgrounds for movies without any green screen
Wow.
or LEDs. And they do this entirely digitally through LLMs. And so um, have you ever watched the Mandalorian season?
I did believe I had watched the first a few episodes, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
If you've watched one of them, you've
Yep.
seen the whole thing, which is Disney. was able to create digital backgrounds, but they do it with these huge LED screens or LCD screens.
Mm,
Yes. So they physically have to put these screens up and then they film in front of them. You don't need the screens anymore with Kubrick. They just do it in software, purely digital. So there's going to be a whole uh, revolution in production tools. Um, and this goes top to bottom of the stack. And in every generation of media technologies, it's always one or two companies that become
yeah.
worth billions of dollars because they came up with a technology that changed the media business. Um, not to mention streaming, which is
Yeah.
actually an application. Um, that's number one. Uh, Number two, we have a company that has figured out how to hook up your real world transactions, like a credit card transaction, with uh, digital currency in a game.
Mm.
And so if you go buy a Whopper, um, the the cost of that Whopper, the value of that Whopper is translated into a digital currency in a game so that you can earn more digital currency without actually having to go and grind your way into it or buy more digital assets. Um, the company
Wait,
itself,
wait, 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 wait. Can I didn't quite get that. Is that like is that a point system? Is it like a point system on a credit card translated into
it's
the?
actual transactions. So they've hooked themselves into Visa and MasterCard. So you make a transaction and they know instantly when you've made the transaction with that card that you've registered in the game and it flows through back into the game. So
But what flows through? The value of whatever you bought?
value of whatever you buy, you get to decide how much it's worth in the game. But you spend $10 in the real world, you get $10 worth of digital currency,
Got
however.
it, got it. Okay, got it, got it. All right, cool.
The Uh, so that's hooking up transactions in the real
Yeah,
world
yeah.
with transactions in the digital world. That's a critical component. Um, and we have you may actually have encountered this, but have you ever heard of immersive experiences? They
No.
had one in San Francisco
Yeah.
like 7 or 8 years ago.
Uh,
That's a company called Enclue.
uh.
And Enclave has started doing its own like NFT museum and yeah, and and kind of immersive experience using Microsoft HoloLens.
Cool.
Uh, HoloLens is like a piece of shit basically, but
Yeah.
they and so they're abandoning it in favor of the Snap spectacles now,
Oh.
and
Oh.
much lighter weight and
Oh.
provide a pass through, not a pass through experience, but a real overlay experience, digital on top of real. And so they're building these immersive experiences all over and they're doing it for other people now. And so the other people are paying them. And so they actually are growing and have a proposition. So out of our Meow Wolf experience, we think this is a critical technology.
Yeah, yeah.
So that and keeps on going. I mean, the other two are one of them is how do you match real world collectibles with digital twins. So you have a picture of a tree on your wall back there. You
Mm,
take a picture of that with an application called Klaka, and it's very, very early on and not very well implemented, but you can then store that and turn it into a digital twin
mm.
and represent value to other people. And then the last one we're talking about is um, avatars. Everybody recognizes the potential for avatars. And right now, it's like you go choose a personality and you talk to that person. That's like character AI. But there's like a dozen other companies working in this way. We found one that has a platform where they will enable you to create your own avatar to represent you in the digital world with your personality. And you can program it without programming. So you can invest your avatar with your personality. um, this is pretty far out, but uh,
I love it.
you know,
Yeah.
I can't quite figure out how to make money off of that. But
Well, I mean, people have been trying this for a long time. I mean, Second Life, again, it's going back to this whole conversation. The theme of this conversation is that these things appear and then they disappear and then they appear again. And Second Life is a lot of what you're just talked about was probably tried by Second Life.
So I just saw a squib about Second Life that says, I haven't heard about Second Life for
yeah,
like
yeah,
10 years.
yeah.
But they've spent $1.3 billion over since they were founded, and they've created a digital economy of 1.1 billion. And it's like, I don't know who the hell hangs out in Second Life. I
Yeah,
mean,
I've never talked to anybody. I have not talked to anybody since my friend Antoine 10 years ago told me that they're going to start doing meetings in Second Life, which they didn't start
yeah,
doing. Maybe it's drug laundering. No
yeah,
offense.
it is.
Yeah.
I just saw this like yesterday. It's
Yeah.
like it's the first time I've seen any publicity about Second Life for 10 years. So,
Okay, so I love these companies and it fits the theme because media, these are all infrastructure companies. These are all companies that are need to build core technology in order to help the media
well, to
yeah,
give you the new experience,
the new experience. So it is an
yeah,
experience. Yeah, yeah.
completely immersive digital experience.
Completely immersive digital experience that is not just virtual reality, but augmented reality as well.
Yeah, you can live in both real and digital at the same time. And
Yeah,
Pokemon is an example of that,
yeah,
right? You use your phone and you can see
yeah.
through the game to the real world.
Okay, I gotta talk about what I'm doing because there's relations. No, I'm gonna save it till uh okay. We got drones, we got we got media technology that's changing the media experience. And what else is going on right now? No, what let's go into the 90s. We got the internet, the phone. How does the phone play into all this? How does the phone merge and evolve over time as what you just described becomes clear?
So the iPhone was introduced in 2007. Everybody knows that the iPhone was the tipping point. Um, when it was introduced, the only apps it had were made by Apple. There was no dev kit, um, no app store. Um, and so if you go back and look at the iPhone 1 compared to the iPhone 16, uh, it was really hard to predict what all the collateral effects would be. Um, and one of the companies I invested in was ended up being called Glue Mobile, and it didn't think that any Apple product would be a good place to host games, so they kept developing games
Oh,
for everything.
because of what happened with PCs and Macs in the beginning.
Yeah,
Yeah,
PCs were
yeah,
always the
yeah,
platform for
yeah,
games.
yeah.
But it turned out that, and Apple didn't intend this, but the iPhone turned out to be a great platform for games, and they figured that out eventually, and they became the first serious game developer for the iPhone. And they were sold to Electronic Arts much later for a couple of billion. Um, and so when you compare understanding, everybody knew the iPhone was like revolutionary, but nobody could actually predict what would happen. Um, and so the evolution of the iPhone with an app store and a dev kit and developer conferences and all that kind of ecosystem eventually led to stuff that Apple had no idea that they would trigger. Um, Even now to the point where, which I think we've talked about before, that your iPhone can talk directly to satellites. And so if the iPhone can communicate without terrestrial networks, you could see a whole evolution of our communication system that doesn't use cell towers. And uh, internet can ride on anything. The internet rides on data on cell towers, but also rides on physical connections. But now, if you have Starlink, you know that you can use the Starlink for the internet, and you don't need Comcast. And so maybe cable goes away. Maybe so. Understanding what the collateral effects can be is half of it. So there was nobody in 2007, including Steve Jobs, that knew how this was going to end up.
How did he change over time in the late 2006? I mean, there's his diagnosis, of course, which probably changed a lot in terms of his energy to focus on it. But from 2006 onwards, how did you see him, or how did Brent see him? How did these people who knew him see him change in terms of the product vision?
Did you ever read Brent's book?
No, I should read it. Okay, I'm gonna put a note.
Becoming Steve Jobs,
Yeah.
because it answers this question
Okay.
directly.
Yeah.
Three evolutions of Steve.
Yeah.
First, the pirate, um, running Apple and developing the Macintosh sporadically. And then after he got fired or left Apple, Steve was, licking his chops. I can't remember what he
Mm.
called it, but understanding what happened to him at Apple. And then he came back to Apple and he had a much higher understanding of how to run a company, how to make it be effective, even though he still yelled at people and fired them on the spot. So he had a much evolved understanding of what his role was. And he really optimized for that. He invested himself entirely in that. He was weird enough that he didn't deal with his illness until it killed him. But
Mm.
uh,
Mm.
so, and I
Mm.
can try to remember when he came back to Apple. It was before 2007 was when the iPhone was introduced, but have to ask here. I think it was like 2001. When did Jobs return to Apple? 96? Nope. Yeah. Apple buys Next in 1996.
Mm.
So in buying it,
He got
uh,
back in. The parasite got in. The
I
beautiful
got back
parasite.
in at
Yeah.
97. This is Search Labs.
Yeah.
Uh, 97, Jobs stages a boardroom coup that results in the resignation of Gil Amelio, then CEO. So I was in that time, 96 to 97, and then the iPhone was 2007. So during those 10 years, he figured out how to run Apple and to optimize it. And part of what he did was he just reduced the product line and focused more. They
Too many
introduced
products. Too many products, and this was before the
many
phone, though.
iterations because there was, stupid people like Gil
Yeah.
Amelio didn't
Yeah.
understand doing what they were supposed to do. Anyway, so even Steve didn't really understand what effect the iPhone would
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
And
But did
uh,
he must have gotten inklings that he wrote about in that later stage before he died.
yeah, and so when did he die? 2016 or
2013, somewhere on there. Yeah. Let's check. 2011.
yeah, 2011. So 4 years between the iPhone and
Okay. Yeah.
its passing. He introduced the iPad, right? But the watch was introduced under Tim Cook, and
Wow. So he was
so
originally diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2003. So that means
yeah,
while he was developing the iPhone and bringing this into existence, he was dealing with this, which I imagine he was already pretty weird. I want to hear more about his weirdness. He said Steve Jobs' weirdness. Like, what's the weirdest thing you remember about him? Weird can be positive benefit, like
I,
hippie.
I can tell you from personal interaction. I mean, the weirdest thing about Steve was the same thing that's the weirdest thing about Elon and
Hmm.
others,
Hmm.
which is he could not care less what you thought of him.
Yeah,
He had
interesting.
uh, no sense of being validated by anybody else. He was entirely uh, self-enclosed. Might not be the right way to say it, but so the anecdote I have is so uh, at one of my agenda conferences, I always had Bill Gates as the last speaker
Hmm.
for 6 years, something like that. And everybody looked forward to that. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people bought ticket to the
So
conference just to listen to Bill Gates speak at the end. And we do a fireside chat. Well, the year that we moved from September to October, um, Bill had already had a trip to go visit the Prime Minister of China. I don't know if that was Xi Jinping at that time, but and in October when our dates were, so I couldn't get Bill to come to the conference because we'd switched the time. And so I went looking for someone else, and I went to Steve. I went down to Cupertino in person, had a meeting with him, and said, "Look, Steve, I'd like you to be the anchor for my conference." He had been there once before, long early on, and but he doesn't hang out with people in the industry, and he doesn't really give a shit what anybody thinks. But so I had to go and make sure that he understood what I was asking him to do. And I made it very clear. And I said, Steve, the one thing you can't do is to come in at the last minute because you have to be there for the conference to know what we're talking about. And he agreed to this, right? He said, okay, I'll attend the whole conference. And that was like, so the conference is in October. This is like in March. So like 6 weeks before the conference happens, we get a call from one of his lackeys who says, is there a private airport near the hotel? And so my staff said, so why would you want to know that? And they said, well, Steve, needs to has other stuff to do and can't come in until the morning of his presentation. And so they reported this to me, and I said, well, then tell him not to come. And so it's like literally 20 seconds later, I get a call from Steve Jobs, and he's on an airplane. And you got to think back to this is the late 90s. So he had some kind of telephone service on his private jet, which Apple paid for, but that's all another story. And he says, what do you mean you don't want me to come to the conference? I don't think he's ever experienced this before that somebody said. And I said, Steve, well, it turns out that, you're too busy to do what I asked you to do. So if you're too busy, that's no problem. I don't need you. I didn't say I don't need you, but it was clear. And he started yelling at me and hung up on me. And it's like, if you think about kind of the mentality that leads to, it's a little bit like my interchange with Elon Musk. It's like
Yeah, actually,
people
I
like
want
that
to.
exist
Yeah.
in their own world, and it's not a normal world that, according to the rest of us. And so he was just totally surprised that somebody had said they don't want him to show up because he's Steve Jobs. You should want him to show up, and if he agreed to show up, then you shouldn't tell him not to come.
But from
So.
from but from the Isaacson biography, got this really interesting point about him, which was the that he did feel it, the shame, and like this is totally from an outsider perspective. He had like a shame trigger to him based on the abandonment, the once he found out that he was adopted.
Mhm.
And so that there's something there as well. There's like a deep thing, but I think that gets to your point as well, which is that essentially we live, well, and the point we were talking about earlier is just like we live in our own worlds, and some people have can project their worlds onto other people. All of us do it, I would say. All of us probably do that.
Yeah, but people like Steve and Elon don't even think about it.
They don't even
They're
think.
not sitting there worrying about it.
Yeah.
So he may have that effect, and you're right. He was adopted and he went through a whole thing with that. But I don't think that Steve Jobs sat around thinking about himself.
Okay, so before we'll go a little bit later if you can. I want to get this Elon Musk story out on paper because I've heard this one before, but I can't remember what exactly was this when he was with Zip2Line. Is that the name of the company? Zip2Line?
Called Zip2, no, not line,
Zip2.
just
Yeah.
um, so you want the whole history, but I mean the original meeting. So he created a company called Zip2 that was sold to, of all companies, Compaq for like $20 million.
Yeah.
He owned almost all of it.
Yeah.
He had raised money, but not very much. And so he got a lot of cash out of that. And that's when Elon turns dangerous, is with a lot of cash. Uh, he then started a new company, and he used 5 million of his proceeds to buy a one-letter
X.
domain.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
X.
Yeah.
And which goes, I mean, it's funny how this just keeps recurring. Um, so he bought X.com and then decided to start an online bank. And this is in like 98 or so.
Yeah.
And he hired a team of engineers from the Royal Bank of Canada and moved them all to Palo Alto into an office on University Avenue above the sourdough place. And so he had an office. An office has been used by a bunch of startup companies over time. And so he had this office up there, and I'd heard about this. Attorney friend of mine said you should take a look at what Elon Musk is doing with X. And so I went in, and I was fascinated by it. I thought this is absolutely true. This is something that should happen. we're going to have online banking one way or another, and
Yeah.
this is the first instance I saw of it. So I talked to the engineers and did my diligence, and then I went back to NEA, and they approved a deal. So I went back to the office to have a meeting with. Remember, this is pre-internet.
Yeah.
Well,
Uh,
internet was just barely going,
yeah.
and so uh, I set an appointment with them because I had the term sheet printed out and in my pocket for investing $5 million at a $20 million valuation in X.com. And so I walk into the office. It was a Friday morning, and uh, and all the lights are off, and there's nobody there. There's one light on in a conference room across the lobby, and so I call out and say hello, and Elon comes out of this conference room with the light on and says, "Oh, come on in." And uh, and so I go, being swift as I am, "What happened to everybody?" And he says, "Oh, I fired them all." And and I said, now I should have just pursued why he fired them, but I didn't.
Uh,
I said, "Wow." It was a very short conversation ultimately. I said, so, wow. So, well, that's a material change,
yeah.
what we call in venture capital.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm going to have to go talk to my partners if we still want to make the investment. And uh, so I left and said I'd follow up with them in the next week. And I was like walking out of the office going, wow, phew,
Missed a bullet. Dodged a bullet there.
I dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
And I go back to my partners on Monday because we had our partner meeting on Monday. And I said, well, things have changed and I'm not going to pursue this investment. I didn't even ask them about it. I
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
he fired the whole staff and so I'm not going to pursue this investment. That same day, I heard that Mike Moritz did the deal, put 5 million in at a $20 million valuation. So I started saying to myself, what does Mike Moritz know that I don't know?
Oh.
And I've learned it since, and I hope I don't make the same mistake twice. But I should have asked him why he fired him and, what was his plan going forward and engaged with him to understand what he was doing. Now,
Mm.
uh, Mike invested and he hired a new CEO who ended up being the reason that X merged with PayPal because PayPal needed a CEO. They had all the technology and stuff but they didn't have a CEO. So they did it, and this is the remarkable thing, is that um, Mike Moritz engineered a 50-50 deal between X and PayPal. So if he owned 5 out of 20, a quarter of X, Elon owned the other 75%. So he ended up owning 37.5% of PayPal. And PayPal took off after that with the CEO. So he made a lot of money off that. And as I say, when Elon gets a lot of money, he's dangerous.
Such a great story. The 50-50 deal wants me to ask a question about um, there's 50-50 deal between PayPal. PayPal at that time was probably David Sachs, Peter Thiel, a few other guys I can't remember at this.
Reid Hoffman,
Reid
it's
Hoffman.
called PayPal Mafia. You can go look it up.
Yeah.
But they didn't have a CEO.
They didn't
And
have
PayPal was not
CEO.
doing well.
Interesting. Okay, they didn't. Yeah, interesting.
So they weren't doing well. And here was Elon with a CEO. I have to look up his name because I can't remember, but it came from the media business, ironically. And I don't know how Mike pulled it off because I don't know who the lead investor was in PayPal or
Mm.
what that negotiation was about, but none of those guys were rich, right? This is the PayPal Mafia that got rich out of the
Before
sale
they
of
were,
PayPal.
yeah, interesting.
PayPal was sold to eBay for whatever it was, billions of dollars. Um, so it started to work after they got the CEO. And Elon was on for the ride. He's actually challenged me on this, but
Yeah,
I remember how this transaction happened. I was not party to it, so I don't know the details,
yeah,
but I do know that PayPal got half and X got half, and they
yeah.
dropped the X name, but he owned that URL himself personally. So it's all coming back, right? He renamed Twitter X and
Well,
the
it,
X app, the everything app.
yeah, with the my investigation into Zip2, all of the stuff that he's currently doing with X right now, he wanted to do with Zip2. Uh,
Yeah.
I'll name some here. Two-way communication between users and advertisers through fax integration, not through fax integration, but with Twitter. And Yellow Pages and business directories, free email service, which he just announced, local arts and entertainment guides. There's no news in there because news probably at that time, well, actually, so that's the last question. What did news look like in 1993 to late 1990s?
Looked like it always had looked like, right?
For the last 500
It
years,
wasn't.
400 years. No, 300 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, the first newspapers were in the 1880s, but
Interesting.
well, the New York Times was established in 1851. So the
1851, yeah.
newspaper,
Yeah.
yeah.
Interesting.
So there were newspapers. There were 27 newspapers when in New York City, daily newspapers when the New York Times started. So there were daily newspapers that were sold for like a penny and on the street. And so the newspaper industry really had been around at that point for what, 150 years. And it had evolved during that time based on printing technologies and distribution. Um,
The core
but
mechanics are the same. It was all in
in the
print.
90s, no one in the newspaper business wanted to believe that they were fucked. They were, but they didn't want
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah,
believe.
yeah. Nobody wanted to believe it.
And then what was the way you distributed music for free? Napster.
Napster, yeah.
Napster happened in the music industry,
Yeah.
right? So the video business was protected because the internet couldn't handle streaming until the aughts and or teens actually. And so Netflix started, by renting DVDs and then, switched to streaming like 5 or 6 years later.
So interesting. Okay. Thank you again, and we'll see each other next week.
Yep. Thank you.